being in this church and knowing of its history in the American Baptist Association and doing what I do here has reminded me of one of my first Christmas experiences with the pastor of the church I grew up in. My parents invited him to our home for Christmas. And I was, 4 or 5. And I had watched him officiate an offering being collected. And so as gifts were being distributed, I sent around my bank and I specifically asked the pastor if he could give some money. And I think he put in, I didn't count, it may have been 2 pennies, I don't know what it was. I think about that, and I've gotten beyond that. But I thought about bringing my bank this morning and maybe helping things out. But anyway, I know there is an end to Romans 12. I know that. We've been in these verses for a while, but today we'll finish this list of 10 items. And I've labeled this everyday Christianity, and I want to emphasize again, these statements, if they're practiced, are radical. And so we've used that word in all the outline. But what is radical to us is what God is after every day. And so we live with that kind of disparity. How in the world can you do these things? And he seems to be saying, of course I want you to do these things. And so, not quite, but yet be complete in obedience. And the things we've talked about are basic things. I wanted to read the list to you. Things we're to be radical about. Commitment to love. Commitment to what is good. Devotion to others. Humility. Zeal. Hope. And this morning, patience. Prayer. Generosity. Hospitality. If someone were to ask us, so what should we be doing as a Christian? This is one of the biblical lists. And the beauty of it is, they're short. It's contained in these verses. 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. What a wonderful summary of things we ought to be doing. And sometimes when you go to church for a year, you get all kinds of things you're supposed to be doing. You know, supporting this project and doing that. And yeah, but what it boils down to really is this list. And when you hear those words, you realize how challenging they are to love. It seems easier to hate, not love. Doing good. We're prone to do bad. And then every now and then we do good, but it's not our nature. Humility. We all have this deep-seated need to be recognized, to be appreciated, to get what is our due, what people owe us, all those things. Zeal and hope. And this morning we begin with patience. Patience. In our family, we've laughed about my father-in-law. He was a wonderful man. Pastored church and all that. But when you were going to move furniture, you know, if you had nice pieces of furniture, you didn't necessarily want him to help you because it was going to fit. And he loved to pack things so it would fit. And I remember Barbara saying to me a number of times, we moved off in our early marriage, you know, we're going here and there and whatever. And she would say, don't let Dad help you put this in. Because if it was just that much, too long, too wide, whatever, it would fit. And it would become the size of the space it was fitted into. Whatever got peeled off. And when he drove lickety-split. And he loved driving fast. And I'm sure he had to work in patience, on patience. Probably he managed to do better than a lot of people who don't have that challenge. This is patience in the midst of affliction. This word for patience can also mean continue to remain underneath it. If you think of affliction as some heavy weight falling on you, don't say, how can I get out of this? I've got to get out of this. I will get out of this. Because God sometimes sends affliction. And he says, I want you to feel the weight of it. I want you to feel what that's like. So you'll know more about me. The word affliction sometimes is rendered tribulation, distress, suffering, hard circumstances, all those things. God says, I want you to build the capacity to endure it. Because something happens in the midst of enduring it. One of them is you begin to release things that you hold dear. I think about Mary Jane in our group. The nastiest case for decades of rheumatoid arthritis. You probably heard Bill, I have, give a recital of the surgery she had. The suffering she lived through. I think about her as an example of a sweet spirit. I marveled when I saw her. She would sit in the back and hold out that twisted hand. About the only thing she could do. And somehow she experienced God in ways some of us didn't. Our bent is to run from affliction. If someone said, would you rather have a pleasant life or an afflicted life? I know we'd all say, well, I need to think it over. No, we aren't going to say that. We know the side we fall on. And here's the deal. I didn't say this early on. The word patience is in a verb form that means you must keep doing this. It's called a present participle. It means don't hang on for 5 minutes. That isn't what he's talking about. In fact, all of these verbal forms are of that sort. I want you to develop this capacity to go through affliction to my glory. Of course, that's what his son did. Of course. The next one is radical prayer. Radical prayer. The word faithful, Rob, you should come up and explain this. The word faithful in prayer is actually a word that's used in cultivation and farming and gardening. I was never any good at gardening because I would think of 2 or 3 days worth of investment. The day you plant the seeds and then the day you go out and rescue this wonderful produce. Of course, I never got to the next day. It was always just the first day. In the ancient world, that was really an agrarian, a farming world, there were cities, of course, and they had commerce and all that, but for the most part, people who lived were living off the soil directly. And they spent a lot of time working the soil, caring for it. There are parts of the ancient world where they had a massive irrigation system. They got water to soil that was dry. They worried about the lay of the land with respect to the sunshine and the hours of sunshine on that land, the tilt toward the sun. They worried about removing stones and other things, impediments in the soil. And I know, Rob, and others too, if you garden, you work at it. You don't just get up and say, well, I'm going to get my binoculars out and see if I can see the strawberries. Oh, I didn't plant them. No, that's right. Well, next year. It is something you work at over time. And I've had enough contact with the farming community over the years, especially in fundraising, to know that there are people that have accumulated a lot of land, and they have worked that land in whatever way they can to enrich it. Paul says, that's the image I want you to catch about praying. And sometimes when we think about praying, we say, and I'm not poo-pooing this, but we say, this year I'm going to pray once every day. Well, great. That's better than praying twice a year. But this thing about faithful praying is a change from we're going to pray at the meal to interacting and discussing with God as you go through the day. God, help me. God, I don't like this. Those things that happen because it's top of the mind. It isn't. If I can't figure it out, I've been working on it for 3 months. All right, I give up. I'm going to pray. And I know how that is. I've gone through periods of my life when try this, try that. Someone says, well, have you been praying about it? Well, yeah, I remember I did once. There's another passage in the New Testament that is sort of like this. Pray without ceasing. And what Paul seems to be suggesting is that this thing of gardening prayer seems to mean you get better at it, you get more comfortable with it, and there is a deepening of the reality of the request. There's some kind of releasing of demands on God and letting go of that. You already begin to acknowledge that He's sovereign. And you begin to feel peace with that. Cultivating prayer. Makes you wonder what our life would be like if we did. We did. Generosity. Verse 13, share with God's people who are in need. It means you get next to them and you actually share things with them. And you know them well enough to know what the need is. And you become open-handed with it. What does that mean about how much you share? I don't know. But it just means that when God moves in your life, you don't go like this. You go like this. I'll help however I can. The early church did that. In fact, in another passage, Paul says the believers at Thessalonica so much cared about helping others, he would go around the country bragging about them. They had learned to be generous. They must have concluded it was God's money to start with. It was God's resources. And so, I'm open, God, to use it however you want, and I want to do that. And sometimes, we think that generosity is best suited to rich people. Of course they should give their money away. They have a lot of it. They won't miss it. I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's talking about whatever you've got, lot or little, have a spirit of openness to that possibility, helping in need. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. But you don't say at the outset, well, I'm not. So tell me about your need. Go ahead and tell me. But I can't hear you. That isn't what he's talking about. Radical hospitality. That's the last of the 10. This one is seems to go over the top. It says practice hospitality. So practice is sort of an easy to live with word. Practice hospitality. You know, get better at serving a meal. Have nice silverware. You know. Don't use broken plates. You know, we think about all those things. That is so far removed from what this is saying, it's childish. And I'm saying that to make a point. The word practice actually has other translations. I want you to listen to them. I want you to pursue it. That's one of the translations. Pursue it. I want you to run after it. I want you to hunt it down. Now, let me add the meaning of the word hospitality. One way to translate that is to be fond of strangers. Now let me paraphrase practice hospitality. I want you to hunt down strangers. You say, I know strange people I'm not going to hunt down. Think about that. God says, I want you to live your life in such a way that when you meet someone you don't know, you say, I'm curious, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to find out about your life. I'd like to hear your story. That begins to build relationship to people. And I think what Paul is saying is, I want you to have a disposition in your life that is able to reach across boundaries of not knowing people. And I think it's good for all of us to think about, am I content to know my little circle and no one else? I know 3 people really well, and they're such good friends. And then the other, I don't know, 7.5 billion, 800 billion people. Well, they aren't worth knowing. Though I want to focus on my group. It's challenging for the gospel to spread, given that. Fond of strangers. Jesus said, Matthew 25, I was a stranger. Do you know the rest of the line? And you took me in. It's amazing that Jesus would say that. And he says it as an example of people that are on the side of God. There were people who took him in. There were people who absolutely rejected him. But he said, he has cast his lot as a stranger with people who took him in. There are other passages in the New Testament. I won't take time this morning to refer to them, but there are a bunch of them. And this short list of 10 items, we've taken more time with just to say, this is one of God's wonderful summaries in Scripture. Not long at all. A few verses that he longs for us to have part of our everyday life. The next section in Romans is about how you treat outsiders, even your enemies. And that's pretty sobering, that section. Father, this morning, as we think about these short statements, we're burdened that too often they don't reflect our life. We confess there are periods of time in our life when maybe 1 or 2 is true, but most of them aren't. And we know you still love us, but you still call us onward to something more, something better, something deeper, something more life-transforming, something more, Father, like your Son. Help us, Lord, to have an openness that's greater and greater to being more like him. We ask in his name. Amen.